Hi everybody, this is Anne. We think about the definition of sculpture as being an artistic form such as a statue where its purpose is primarily for commemorating important events or simply being thought-provoking, as opposed to objects which are designated to have more functional uses. But this doesn't have to always be the case. In this video, I'll show you how to combine sculptural forms with functional ones as we make 3 simple altered and sculpted mugs. The first mug I call the pregnant mug. I started with a 1-pound ball of clay on the wheel. I centered the mound and hollowed out the insides. I widened it outward and compressed the floor. I began to pull up the walls into a cylinder shape. I was concentrating on coning the clay wall inward with each successive pull at this point, as this is how you achieve better height. I used my red rib on the inside and outside to compress, smooth, and even the walls. I used my needle tool to trim the rim so it was even. Once I had the height of the mug, then I began to shape it. Really pay attention to stretching the clay to the right form now, because once you begin altering, you can't go back and change your mind. I began to push outward against the inner wall from the bottom up to get a heavy bottom bulbous type of shape. I'm always worried about my clay rim warping in the kiln, as my fine porcelain seems to be more prone to this at the high fire, so I'm almost obsessive about rounding and compressing to give it that round memory. In addition, I gently stretch the clay outward slightly, right under the rim, creating a little bulge. This step is an attempt to separate the rim from the bottom part of the mug, where all the altering is going to be. Right under that bulge, there'll be the waist area of the sculpture, so I use my red rib to accentuate that. I use my wooden bevel tool to trim away some of the extra clay around the foot. I reevaluated things at this point and decided to make the belly of the mug just a little more pregnant before I started sculpting. To begin the altering process, I'm going to take a dart right under the waist, which will be on her backside. I traced out about a 3/4 inch long dart first with my needle tool, then cut out a small leaf shape around that and punched it out. I scored the area inside the dart with my needle tool. I then pushed the side walls of the dart slightly inward and pinched the clay together, closing up the gap that I made on the outside. Really work that clay together well. You can see that the clay is still opened a bit on the inside, so I work the clay together there with my fingers. It's a little hard to see here, but I'm adding a bit of clay into the gap as a reinforcement against cracking as it dries. Once I had a good seal, I could see that the altering process misshaped the rim, so I went back and rounded it out again. Now here's the profile that I was hoping for. I gave her a bit of a pooch for her derriere. To further accentuate her rear, I used the straight edge of a stick to push it against the bulbous backside to slightly separate it into halves. I used my fingers to sculpt that area and define it. I then used my thumbs under her rear to push the clay back inward to form the separation between the buttocks and the legs. I put my hand back inside the form and pushed outward to bulge out the cheeks a little bit more. So the dart we made earlier becomes the small of her back, and the gap from the top of her rear to the bulge under the rim will be where I place a handle when it's leather hard. I turned the mug around to the pregnant belly side and pushed in a bit where the belly button would be. I then added a little ball to the inside of that. Now here's one that I made earlier, where you can see the handle hides the bulges on either side of the dart. When it was bone dry, I painted it with underglazes around her waist so as not to hide too much of the sculpted areas along the bottom. I even painted the foot. I bisque fired it, then glazed it. I decided to paint carnations as they're the symbols of eternal love of a mother to her children. I also painted butterflies as they're symbols of transformation, hope, and rebirth. For those who might not be comfortable making darts in their mugs, I'll demonstrate a simple design just altering it with my fingers. I threw the mug just like the last one, but this time I concentrated on pushing the base of the mug inward to narrow it. I then used my red rib to smooth and compress the wall. Carefully, I used my fingers on the inside of the mug to belly it out just a bit and give her a nice hip. This stretching will also help the clay to create a memory and hold its shape in the kiln. Again, I used my red rib to compress and smooth it to the form that I wanted. Like the first mug, I rounded and compressed the rim, then slightly bulged out the clay just under the rim to help keep it round during firing. I then bulged out the clay a little more under that, which will give her a bit of a waist. Using my beveled stick, I shaped and compressed that foot area where her legs would narrow down. Starting with her front side, I slightly impressed a straight line from the foot, then used my fingers to work that area into a separation for the legs. The clay developed sharp edges when I separated it, so I wet my fingers and rounded those off. I used my needle tool to remove little bits of clay along the foot to accentuate the split between her legs. I used my fingers to push the clay inward at the top of the legs to form the belly. I pushed in an area for the belly button, adding a little bit of clay to the center of that. I repeated these steps for her backside. I used a straight edge to separate her butt cheeks. From the inside, I pushed the clay outward to give her bottom more volume. Again, I used my needle tool to remove bits of the clay along the foot for the separation of the legs. With a wet finger, I smoothed away and rounded the harder, sharp edges and accentuated the area where the legs and the buttocks join. Using my finger across the top of her butt cheeks, I pushed it inward to give her the small of a back. Again, I rounded the rim and reshaped the bulge part so it was more part of the sculpture. Now here's one that I made earlier, where you can see that the little bulge right under the rim becomes a border for the mug where your lips will be. I placed the handle over the small of her back. I thought it'd be fun to paint fig leaves and figs on the mug as a nod to medieval censorship in the 1500s when religious conservatives tried to cover over naked statues. Of course, I also painted the bluebirds, which would eat up those figs. Finally, for those who are comfortable making the darts, let's do a mug where we attempt to give the figure a Contrapposto pose by cutting 2 darts. I traced out my first dart right on top of the hip area and cut that out. I scored the inside of the gap, then squeezed the clay shut. I worked the clay together well and placed a little clay on the inside to reinforce the area. I turned the piece to the opposite side and created another dart, this time on the top part of the hourglass so the 2 darts are asymmetrical. Again, I worked the clay back together, closing the gap on the outside and the inside. This gave me a bit of an unsightly bulge, which I was careful to round back out without destroying the alteration that I had made. Now here's the straight-on shot where you can see on the left side the slightly lowered hip and lowered shoulder compared to the right side, characteristic of the Contrapposto pose. If the hip lowers, the knee would bend, causing one leg to slightly cross over the other. So instead of impressing a straight line as a separation for the leg, I sculpted out a diagonal line from the foot running from the right side towards the lowered hip. I'm also defining the part of the body that would overhang the ends of the legs and up to the hips. I was sure to push the hips outward a little, giving them definition. Again, I pushed in for the belly button. As this mug has a pronounced chest area, I gave her a little cleavage. I turned the mug around and sculpted out a line running from the foot on the right side up towards the left hip to divide the legs at the back. I used my thumbs to give her a rear and defined and smoothed that area between the legs with a sharp edge of the tool. I used a straight edge to create the separation in the butt cheeks. Remember that her butt cheeks will also be asymmetrical, with one cheek being lower than the other. I pushed the clay out from the inside to give her cheeks some volume. The cheek with the lowered hip would be a little bigger than the other one. There she is. Adding the Contrapposto pose provides just a little more realism to how someone would be standing. Here's one I made earlier. Instead of placing the handle in the back like the others, I placed it to the side like a hand on the hip, which furthers the illusion of the human form. I painted this one with a border around the rim and a belt around her middle, of course also adding a vine of morning glories to echo the belt and a little cardinal flying in the distance. The best tip I can give you is to remember to do the alterations to these forms during the window when the clay is soft but not soggy, and definitely not when the clay has reached the leather hard stage. Thanks to the newest members of our Little Street Pottery Research Facility team. If you'd like to join the team and earn a title, click on the Super Thanks button or the link to buy me a coffee. It also really helps us out if you hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. See you next time in the studio.
Hey Google, bubble that butt.
Sorry, I didn't understand.